Every empire falls the same way, not sometimes, every time. And if you think that sentence does not apply to you, to your savings account, to your retirement, to the dollars in your wallet right now, you are making the same mistake that every citizen of every declining empire in the last 3,000 years has made. They assumed they were the exception. On July 4, 2026, the United States of America turns 250 years old. And in 1976, a retired British lieutenant general named Sir John Glubb published a 24-page essay called The Fate of Empires and the Search for Survival, in which he studied every major empire of the last 3,000 years and discovered that they all follow the same 7-stage life cycle, and they all last approximately 250 years. The Assyrian Empire lasted 247 years. The Ottoman Empire lasted 250. The Spanish Empire lasted 250. The British Empire lasted 250. Romanov-Russia lasted 234. The Arab Empire lasted 246. And America turns 250 this year. And America just entered stage 7. And what I am about to show you over the next 25 minutes is the evidence drawn from 3 independent scholars working across 3 different decades using 3 different methodologies that the United States of America is following the identical trajectory that destroyed every empire that came before it. Sir John Glubb studied 3,000 years of history and found that empires die on a schedule. You have probably never heard of Sir John Glubb. Most Americans have not. He was a British Army officer who served in World War I, spent decades commanding the Arab Legion in Jordan, and after his retirement in 1956, devoted the rest of his life to studying why civilizations rise and fall. His essay examined the Assyrian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire under Alexander, the Roman Republic and Empire, the Arab Empire, the Mamluki Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Spanish Empire, Romanov-Russia, and the British Empire. And despite the fact that these empires were separated by thousands of years, existed on different continents, spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and wielded completely different technologies, they all followed the same trajectory. Every single one. Glubb identified 7 stages that appear in sequence in every empire he studied. Stage 1 is the Age of Pioneers, when a small, vigorous, disciplined people rise from obscurity through courage, sacrifice, and collective effort. Stage 2 is the Age of Conquest, when military expansion brings territory, resources, and power. Stage 3 is the Age of Commerce, when stability enables trade and the wealth of the nation begins to grow. Stage 4 is the Age of Affluence, when prosperity becomes the dominant feature of national life and comfort replaces duty as the organizing principle of society. Stage 5 is the Age of Intellect, when universities multiply, public discourse intensifies, and the nation begins to question everything that made it powerful, not out of curiosity, but out of exhaustion with its own identity. Stage 6 is the Age of Decadence, when celebrity replaces heroism, entertainment replaces purpose, cynicism replaces conviction, and the population becomes so fragmented that it can no longer agree on what the nation is for. And Stage 7 is Decline and Collapse, when the internal erosion becomes visible externally, when rival powers sense weakness, when the currency loses its dominance, when the debt becomes unserviceable, when the institutions that were supposed to protect the nation are captured by the people they were supposed to regulate, and when the population, divided and exhausted, simply stops believing that the system can be saved. Glubb's most disturbing finding was not the stages themselves, it was the timing. The entire life cycle, from stage 1 to stage 7, takes approximately 250 years, 10 generations, and the pattern held across every empire he studied, regardless of size, geography, religion, or technology. The pattern is not driven by external forces. It is driven by the internal transformation of the people who live inside the empire. Hardship produces discipline. Discipline produces expansion. Expansion produces wealth. Wealth produces comfort. Comfort produces fragmentation. Fragmentation produces collapse. The cycle is not a theory about politics or economics. It is a theory about human nature. And human nature, as Glubb documented across 3,000 years, does not change. And Glubb made one more observation that is particularly relevant to this moment. He noted that in every empire he studied, the transition from stage 6 to stage 7 was marked by a specific behavioral shift in the population. During the Age of Affluence and the Age of Intellect, the population debates the empire's problems vigorously. Universities produce analyses. Commentators produce opinions. Politicians produce promises. There is an abundance of talk, of criticism, of awareness. Everyone knows the problems exist. The awareness is not the issue. The issue is that the awareness does not translate into action because the population has become too fragmented to form the consensus necessary for collective action. Every proposed solution is opposed by a faction that benefits from the current arrangement. Every reform is blocked by an interest that would lose from the change. Every election produces a mandate that is immediately contested by the losing side. And the machinery of governance, which was designed for a society capable of compromise, grinds to a halt in a society that has lost the capacity for it. The empire does not die from ignorance, it dies from paralysis. The disease is diagnosed, the treatment is known. The patient refuses the medicine because the patient is actually 330 million patients who cannot agree on the prescription. And while they argue about the prescription, the disease progresses from treatable to terminal. That transition from awareness without action to consequences without remedy is the threshold of stage 7. And the United States crossed it somewhere between 2020 and 2025, when the list of problems that everyone acknowledges but no one can solve, the debt, the infrastructure, social security, healthcare costs, housing affordability, the immigration system, the tax code, the campaign finance system, the declining industrial base, became so long and so interconnected that addressing any one of them without addressing all of them became functionally impossible. And addressing all of them simultaneously requires a political consensus that does not exist and cannot exist in a system designed to reward division. Ray Dalio spent $100 million building a model that says the same thing, and America is declining on 15 of 18 indicators. In 2021, Ray Dalio, the billionaire founder of Bridgewater Associates, the largest hedge fund in the world, published a book called Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. Dalio spent years and an estimated $100 million building a quantitative model that tracks the rise and fall of empires using 18 specific indicators: education quality, innovation and technology, economic competitiveness, military strength relative to rivals, trade volume, economic output, financial center status, reserve currency share, governance efficiency, rule of law, income inequality, internal conflict, debt burden, money printing, capital market development, infrastructure quality, natural disaster exposure, and resource allocation efficiency. Dalio's model scored every major empire over the past 500 years across these 18 dimensions and plotted their trajectories over time. And the pattern matched Glubb's findings almost exactly. The Dutch Empire rose, peaked, and declined. The British Empire rose, peaked, and declined. And the American Empire rose, peaked somewhere around 1950 to 2000, and is now declining on nearly every indicator. The United States still scores number 1 overall in Dalio's framework, but it is declining on 15 of the 18 indicators. Education quality is declining relative to competitors. Economic competitiveness is declining. Military dominance relative to rivals is declining because China's military spending has increased 7-fold in the past 20 years, while America's has remained relatively flat in real terms. Reserve currency share is declining from 71% of global reserves in 2000 to approximately 59% today. Internal conflict is increasing. Debt burden is increasing from 34% of GDP in 2000 to 100% today. Income inequality is increasing, with the top 1% owning more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Governance efficiency is declining, as evidenced by the 3 credit rating downgrades from all 3 major agencies, government shutdowns, debt ceiling standoffs, and a political system that cannot pass legislation to address any of the structural problems that the model identifies. Dalio's conclusion is not that America is doomed. His conclusion is that the trajectory is unmistakable, and that the markers of decline that appeared in the Dutch and British empires before their falls are now appearing in the United States at an accelerating pace. And Dalio is not an academic. He is the most successful hedge fund manager in history. He built his fortune by being right about these patterns. And his model says America is in decline, not approaching decline. In it. And Dalio identified one indicator that he considers more important than all the others combined: the reserve currency indicator. Because every empire in the last 500 years that lost its reserve currency status lost it during stage 7. And the loss of reserve currency status is the event that converts gradual decline into accelerating decline. The reason is straightforward. The reserve currency is the privilege that allows an empire to borrow cheaply, consume more than it produces, run persistent trade and fiscal deficits, and fund military commitments that exceed its productive capacity. It is, in Dalio's framework, the last structural advantage to erode. Everything else can decline: education, manufacturing, institutional trust, military dominance relative to rivals, and the empire can persist as long as the reserve currency holds. Because the reserve currency allows the empire to fund the gap between what it produces and what it consumes by printing money that the rest of the world is willing to accept. When the rest of the world stops accepting it, the gap becomes unfundable. And the lifestyle, the military commitments, the transfer programs, and the debt service that the reserve currency funded all become simultaneously unaffordable. The Dutch guilder lost its reserve status in the 18th century. The British pound lost it in the mid-20th century. And in both cases, the loss was gradual, then sudden. The reserve share declined slowly for decades as confidence eroded, then collapsed rapidly when a catalyzing event, usually a war or a financial crisis, destroyed the remaining credibility. The dollar is in the gradual phase, from 71% to 59% in 25 years. And the catalyzing event could be the current war, a debt ceiling default, a politicized Federal Reserve, or a combination of all three. Dalio's model does not predict the specific event. It predicts that the event will come. And when it comes, the transition from gradual to sudden will catch the American public by surprise, just as the pound's collapse caught the British public by surprise, because the public was told at every stage that the currency was strong, that the fundamentals were solid, and that this time was different. Peter Turchin predicted the 2020 would be America's most unstable decade since the Civil War. And he was right. In 2010, a complexity scientist named Peter Turchin published a paper in the journal Nature, in which he predicted, based on mathematical models of historical cycles, that the 2020 would be the most politically unstable decade in the United States since the 1860s. He was mocked at the time. He is no longer mocked. Turchin developed a field called cryodynamics, which applies quantitative analysis to historical patterns the same way physicists apply mathematics to physical systems. And his model identified three structural drivers of societal instability that recur in approximately 50-year cycles in American history. The first driver is elite overproduction, which is the phenomenon of too many people competing for too few positions of power and prestige. When a society produces more educated, ambitious, credentialed people than the system can absorb into positions of authority, the surplus elites become frustrated, radicalized, and eventually turn against the system that failed to accommodate them. The second driver is popular immiseration, which is the decline of real wages and living standards for the working population even as the economy grows. When GDP goes up but the median worker's purchasing power goes down, the population does not experience economic growth as prosperity. They experience it as exploitation. The third driver is state fiscal crisis, which is the point at which government debt, entitlement obligations, and interest payments consume so large a share of revenue that the state can no longer fund the services, infrastructure, and defense that maintain social order and public trust. Turchin traced these three drivers through American history and identified peaks of instability in the 1870s, the 1920s, the 1970s, and predicted the next peak for the 2020s. The 1870s produced labor wars, political assassinations, and the most contested election in American history. The 1920s produced anarchist bombings, mass strikes, the Palmer raids, and the conditions that led to the Great Depression. The 1970s produced the anti-war movement, Watergate, stagflation, and a crisis of institutional legitimacy. And the 2020s have produced a global pandemic, an attempted insurrection, 2 impeachments, 3 credit rating downgrades, a war in the Middle East launched without congressional authorization, record consumer debt, record institutional distrust, and the lowest consumer sentiment ever recorded. Turchin was right. The 2020s are the most unstable decade since the Civil War era, and his model says the instability has not peaked, it is still building. The drivers, elite overproduction, popular immiseration, and fiscal crisis are all intensifying, not resolving. There is no mechanism in the current political system that addresses any of them, and Turchin's model predicts that the instability will continue until either the structural drivers are resolved through deliberate reform or the system undergoes a violent restructuring. Those are the only 2 exits that the historical data supports, reform or rupture, and the window for reform is closing. And there is one more dimension to Turchin's model that most summaries of his work miss. He also identified what he calls the wealth pump, the mechanism by which wealth is transferred from the working population to the elite during the later stages of the cycle. The wealth pump operates through 3 channels simultaneously. First, labor markets tighten not in favor of workers but against them, as automation, offshoring, and immigration policy combine to suppress wage growth while productivity increases. The productivity gains go to capital owners. The wage stagnation goes to workers. Second, asset inflation driven by central bank policy and fiscal deficits disproportionately benefits asset holders. Stock markets, real estate, and financial instruments appreciate, enriching the people who already own them while pricing out the people who do not. The top 10% of American households own approximately 89% of all stocks. When the stock market doubles, the top 10% captures nearly all of the gain. When housing prices increase 81% in 9 years, existing homeowners gain wealth while aspiring homeowners are locked out. Third, the tax code is progressively restructured to favor capital income over labor income. Capital gains are taxed at lower rates than wages. Carried interest allows hedge fund managers to pay lower effective tax rates than their secretaries. The estate tax exemption has been raised to $13.6 million per individual, effectively eliminating the inheritance tax for all but the largest fortunes. The wealth pump in Turchin's framework is not a conspiracy. It is a structural feature of late-stage empires that accelerates inequality until the system becomes unsustainable. And the United States in 2026 has the highest level of wealth concentration since the Gilded Age. The top 1% owns more than the bottom 90% combined. And the political system, which is supposed to regulate the wealth pump, has been captured by the beneficiaries of the wealth pump through a campaign finance system that allows unlimited spending on elections. The people who benefit most from the inequality are the people who fund the campaigns of the legislators who write the tax code that maintains the inequality. That is not democracy regulating capitalism. That is capitalism regulating democracy. And that inversion, the capture of the political system by the economic elite, is another symptom that appears in every empire during Stage 6 and Stage 7 of Glubb's cycle. Spain went through exactly what America is going through right now, and most Americans have no idea how that story ended. You want to know what Stage 7 looks like? Look at Spain. In the 16th century, Spain was the most powerful empire on Earth. It controlled territory across 4 continents. It had the most powerful military in Europe. It had more gold and silver than any nation in history, flowing in from the Americas by the shipload. Spanish currency was the global reserve. Spanish culture dominated the Western world. Spanish universities were the finest in Europe. And within 100 years, Spain was bankrupt, irrelevant, and a cautionary tale studied by every economic student on Earth. What happened? Spain stopped producing and started importing. The gold and silver from the Americas made Spain so wealthy that its people stopped manufacturing goods. Why produce when you can buy? Why build when you can import? The merchant class atrophied. Productive capacity was replaced by financial speculation and government spending funded by mineral wealth. Sound familiar? The United States manufacturing sector employed 17.6 million Americans in 2000. By 2026, that number has fallen to approximately 12.8 million despite the population growing by 50 million. Manufacturing fell from 28% of GDP in 1953 to 11% today. America imports $3.1 trillion in goods per year, including electronics, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, and semiconductor chips. Taiwan produces 92% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. China dominates rare earth mineral processing. India produces a third of America's generic pharmaceuticals. Supply chains that were once domestic are now global, and global supply chains are vulnerable to exactly the kind of disruption the Strait of Hormuz closure has demonstrated. Spain's dependence on imported goods made it vulnerable to disruptions in its supply of American silver. America's dependence on imported goods makes it vulnerable to disruptions in the shipping lanes those goods travel through. The vulnerability is structural, not temporary. Spain fought wars on 4 continents simultaneously. Military expenditures consumed half of all government spending at the empire's peak. Overextension across the globe, funding conflicts in the Netherlands, in the Mediterranean, in the Pacific, in the Americas, drained the treasury faster than the gold mines could fill it. Sound familiar? Spain debased its currency. As the cost of maintaining the empire outpaced revenue, the crown repeatedly debased silver coins, reducing their metal content while maintaining their face value. Inflation surged. The purchasing power of ordinary Spaniards collapsed. The gap between the official value of the currency and its actual buying power widened until the system lost credibility entirely. Sound familiar? Spain declared bankruptcy 4 times, in 1557, 1575, 1596, and 1607, the Spanish crown defaulted on its sovereign debt. Each default was preceded by the same pattern: rising military costs, rising interest payments on existing debt, declining revenue from a productive economy that had been hollowed out by cheap imports and currency manipulation. and political leadership that refused to cut spending because the empire's prestige depended on maintaining the appearance of strength. Sound familiar? And the most important parallel of all, Spain's decline was not visible to ordinary Spaniards while it was happening. The gold kept coming, the military kept fighting, the government kept spending, the currency kept circulating. From the inside, the empire looked strong. From the outside, everyone could see the rot. And by the time ordinary Spaniards understood what had happened, the damage was irreversible. The productive capacity was gone. The currency was debased. The debt was unserviceable. The military was overextended. And the treasury was empty. The United States in 2026 has a national debt of $36 trillion. Interest payments on that debt have crossed $1 trillion per year, more than the entire defense budget. The dollar's share of global reserves has declined from 71% to 59% in 25 years. Manufacturing as a share of GDP has fallen from 28% in 1953 to approximately 11% today. The military is deployed in approximately 80 countries across 750 to 800 bases. The defense budget request for fiscal year 2026 is $892.6 billion, with the House Armed Services Committee pushing for $925 billion. And the country is fighting a war in the Middle East that was launched without congressional authorization, that has closed the Strait of Hormuz, that has pushed oil above $100 per barrel, that has triggered the worst inflation spike in 4 years, and that the oil industry is warning will get worse before it gets better. Spain's story is not a metaphor. It is a template. And America is following it with the precision of a GPS navigation system locked onto a destination that no one in the car wants to arrive at, but no one is willing to reprogram. And here is a data point about Spain that most Americans will find uncomfortably specific. At the height of its power, Spain was the world's largest debtor. Spanish government bonds were held by investors across Europe. The interest payments on those bonds consumed an ever larger share of tax revenue, crowding out spending on infrastructure, education, and domestic industry. When Spain defaulted in '57, the ripple effects crashed banks in Augsburg, Antwerp, and Genoa. The financial contagion from a single sovereign default spread across the continent in weeks. Today, U.S. Treasury securities serve as the foundation of the global financial system. They are used as collateral in approximately $26 trillion in financial transactions. A U.S. default, even a brief technical default triggered by a debt ceiling standoff, would send shockwaves through every financial market on Earth. Spain defaulted 4 times and survived as a nation, but it never recovered its position as a global power. The defaults marked the beginning of a permanent relegation from the center of the world to the periphery. And the United States has already been downgraded by all 3 major rating agencies. Moody's, the last holdout, pulled the AAA rating on May 16, 2025, after 108 years. Countries that lose their top credit rating rarely recover it within a generation. Britain was downgraded and never recovered. France has been downgraded multiple times and has not recovered. The downgrades are not a political opinion. They are a financial verdict rendered by institutions whose entire business model depends on accurately assessing the probability that a borrower will pay its debts. And the verdict is that America's probability of paying has declined. Britain's fall from empire took 50 years, and most British citizens did not realize it was happening until they could not afford groceries. The British Empire is the closest historical parallel to the United States because it was the most recent global hegemon. It operated the world's reserve currency. It maintained the world's largest navy. It controlled global trade routes, and its decline unfolded in living memory. British citizens in 1920 believed their empire was eternal. They had won World War I. They controlled a quarter of the world's land surface. The British pound was the reserve currency. London was the financial center of the world. The Royal Navy was unchallenged. The Suez Canal, the most strategically important waterway on Earth, was under British control. And within 30 years, the empire was gone. What happened follows Glubb's stages so precisely that it reads like a script that history performed on schedule. World War I and World War II drained British finances. The wars were necessary. They were also ruinous. Britain entered World War I as the world's creditor. It emerged from World War II as the world's debtor. The transition from creditor to debtor is the financial signature of Stage 7. It is the moment when an empire begins borrowing to maintain the lifestyle and the commitments that its productive economy can no longer fund. Britain's transition happened between 1914 and 1945. America's transition happened between 2000 and 2020, when the United States went from a surplus nation to a nation carrying $36 trillion in debt. And the speed of that transition is itself historically unusual. Britain's transition from creditor to debtor took 30 years and was driven by two existential world wars. America's took 20 years and was driven by tax cuts, voluntary wars, a financial crisis, a pandemic, and structural spending increases that were never offset by revenue. No world war was necessary. The empire simply chose to spend more than it earned, decade after decade, and funded the difference by borrowing from the same nations that are now its strategic competitors. China is simultaneously America's largest creditor and its most significant geopolitical rival. Saudi Arabia has conducted oil transactions in yuan. Brazil and China have settled bilateral trade in their own currencies. The BRICS nations are actively developing alternative payment systems. India's unified payments interface is processing more digital transactions per month than the entire yuan on its payment card network. None of these individually threatens the dollar's reserve status. Collectively, they represent the same gradual diversification that preceded the pound's decline, and the pound's defenders used the same arguments that the dollar's defenders use today. The pound was backed by the world's largest economy. There was no viable alternative. All of those arguments were true, and all became irrelevant when the underlying fiscal trajectory became unsustainable. Britain lost its reserve currency status gradually. Then suddenly, the pound's share of global reserves declined steadily from the 1920s through the 1960s, then collapsed after the 1967 devaluation. The process took 40 years. The dollar's share of global reserves has been declining since 2000, from 71% to 59% in 25 years. Central banks are diversifying into gold, the yuan, and other currencies at an accelerating pace. The People's Bank of China has reduced its treasury holdings from $1.3 trillion to approximately $760 billion. Gold has tripled to $4,500 an ounce as central banks globally buy at record levels for 4 consecutive years. The pattern is identical to what happened to the pound. The timeline is compressing. Britain lost the Suez Canal in 1956 when it attempted a military operation to maintain control of the waterway and the United States. The rising power forced Britain to withdraw by threatening to crash the pound. That moment, the Suez Crisis, is universally recognized by historians as the event that marked the definitive end of the British Empire. Not because Britain lost military capability, because Britain was forced to acknowledge that it no longer had the financial independence to act without the approval of its creditor. America today borrows from China, Japan, and dozens of other nations to fund its military operations, its government spending, and its consumer economy. The question that Suez answered for Britain, whether the empire could still act independently of its creditors, has not yet been answered for America. But the question is being asked, and the fact that it is being asked is itself a symptom of Stage 7. And the Suez parallel to the current Iran war is striking in ways that most commentators have not noted. In 1956, Britain launched a military operation in the Middle East to maintain control of a critical waterway that was essential to its economic interests. The United States, as Britain's creditor, told Britain to stop. Britain stopped. The empire was effectively over. In 2026, the United States launched a military operation in the Middle East that resulted in the closure of a critical waterway that is essential to the entire global economy. But this time, there is no external creditor powerful enough to tell the United States to stop. China holds $760 billion in treasury securities. Japan holds more. But neither has the leverage that America had over Britain in 1956, because the dollar is still the reserve currency and the U.S. military is still the most powerful on Earth, so the war continues. And the waterway remains closed, and the economic damage accumulates. And the question that hangs over the entire situation is whether the Iran war is America's Suez moment, the event that reveals the gap between the empire's self-image and its actual capacity, not because an external power forced the revelation, but because the consequences of the action itself are exposing the fragility that was previously hidden. Britain's Suez was imposed from outside. America's Suez, if that is what the Iran war turns out to be, will be self-inflicted. And self-inflicted Suez moments are harder to recover from, because there is no external actor to blame and no external force to stop the damage. The empire must confront its own limitations, without the convenience of an adversary to distract from the internal reckoning. And that reckoning, in Glubb's framework, is the defining characteristic of Stage 7. Rome did not fall in a day, and neither will America, but the Roman pattern is playing out in real time in 2026. Every American knows the phrase, "Rome wasn't built in a day." Almost no American knows the equally important corollary. Rome was not destroyed in a day either. The fall of the Western Roman Empire took approximately 300 years from the crisis of the 3rd century around 235 AD to the deposition of the last emperor in 476 AD. And during those 300 years, Roman citizens continued to live in Roman cities, use Roman roads, worship in Roman temples, shop in Roman markets, and tell themselves that the empire was eternal. The decline was invisible from the inside because it was gradual, but the pattern was unmistakable from the outside. Rome debased its currency. The Roman denarius, which originally contained approximately 4.5 grams of pure silver, was progressively diluted by successive emperors until it contained less than 5% silver. The debasement was invisible to ordinary Romans because the coins looked the same, they had the same markings, they had the same face value. But the purchasing power of each coin declined with each debasement, and prices rose, and the gap between what the currency was supposed to be worth and what it could actually buy widened until the entire monetary system collapsed. The United States has not physically debased its coins, but it has done the functional equivalent through monetary expansion. The M2 money supply, the broadest measure of dollars in circulation, increased from approximately $15.4 trillion in January 2020 to approximately $21.5 trillion by early 2022, a 40% increase in 2 years. That is the modern equivalent of diluting the silver content of the denarius. The coins look the same. The bills look the same. The number in your bank account looks the same. But the purchasing power of each dollar has declined by approximately 26% since 2019. You are holding debased currency. You just cannot see the debasement because it is expressed in prices rather than in metal content. Rome built infrastructure it could not maintain. The Roman road system, the aqueducts, the public baths, the forums, and the temples were engineering marvels that required continuous maintenance. As the empire's fiscal resources were consumed by military spending, debt service, and the grain dole that fed the urban population, maintenance budgets were cut, the roads crumbled, the aqueducts leaked. The infrastructure that had been the pride of the empire became a monument to its decline. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives American infrastructure a cumulative grade of C-. The estimated investment needed to bring American infrastructure to a state of good repair is $4.6 trillion. Bridges, water systems, electrical grids, roads, airports, and public transit are all deteriorating faster than they are being repaired. The pattern is identical to Rome. The empire built systems it can no longer afford to maintain, and the physical decay of the infrastructure is the visible expression of the fiscal decay underneath. Rome's military became a mercenary force. In the early Republic, Roman soldiers were citizen farmers who fought out of patriotic duty and returned to their fields after the campaign. By the late Empire, the legions were overwhelmingly composed of non-Roman mercenaries who fought for pay rather than for the nation. The loyalty of the military shifted from the state to the general who paid them. The United States military is an all-volunteer force that draws disproportionately from economically distressed communities. Recruitment has fallen short of targets in recent years. The military increasingly relies on contractors, private security firms, and technological force multipliers rather than citizen engagement. The nation spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, but a declining share of the population has any personal connection to the military or any stake in its missions. That disconnection between the society and its military is another symptom that Glubb and Dalio both identified as characteristic of Stage 7. And the bread and circuses parallel is the one that should disturb you the most. In the late Roman Republic and throughout the empire, the government provided free grain to the urban poor through a program called the annona. At its peak, approximately 200,000 Roman citizens received free grain. The program was not designed to feed the hungry. It was designed to prevent the hungry from rioting. It was a political tool that kept the population docile while the empire's productive capacity declined, while the military consumed an ever larger share of the budget, and while the currency was debased. The modern American equivalents are not identical, but they are structurally parallel. SNAP feeds 40 million Americans. Medicaid covers over 90 million. Social Security supports 67 million. Unemployment insurance, housing assistance, disability payments, and other transfer programs collectively support tens of millions more. The total cost of mandatory spending programs now exceeds 60% of the federal budget. And as with Rome's grain dole, the American transfer programs are politically impossible to cut even as they become fiscally impossible to sustain. The Social Security Trust Fund is projected to be depleted by 2032 or 2033. When that happens, benefits face an automatic 23 to 28% cut under current law. Medicare's Hospital Insurance Trust Fund faces a similar trajectory. And the legislative body that is supposed to address these timelines has not introduced a single piece of legislation to fix either one. Not one bill, neither party. Because fixing them requires either raising taxes or cutting benefits, and neither option is politically survivable. So the empire continues distributing grain that it cannot afford to a population that cannot survive without it, funded by debt that the next generation will be unable to repay. That is stage 7. That is where we are. And the bread and circuses continue because stopping them would trigger the instability that the bread and circuses are designed to prevent. America turns 250 on July 4, 2026, and the coincidence with Glubb's 250-year cycle is the most uncomfortable fact in modern economics. On July 4, 2026, the United States celebrates its 250th birthday, the semi-quincentennial. And the coincidence with Glubb's 250-year empire cycle is not a coincidence that any economist, historian, or policy analyst can comfortably dismiss. Glubb was not making a prediction about America. He published his essay in 1976, when America was exactly 200 years old. But his finding that empires cluster around a 250-year lifespan consistently across 3,000 years of human history means that the 250th anniversary of the United States arrives at the exact moment when the pattern says the empire should be entering its final phase. And the empirical evidence does not contradict the pattern. It confirms it. The national debt is $36 trillion and growing. All 3 credit rating agencies have downgraded the United States from AAA. Interest payments on the debt exceed $1 trillion per year. The dollar's reserve status is declining. The military is overextended across 80 countries. Manufacturing has been hollowed out. Infrastructure is crumbling. Consumer sentiment is at a 75-year low. Income inequality is at a level not seen since the Gilded Age. Political polarization is at a level not measured in the modern polling era. Trust in institutions, Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, the media, law enforcement, is at historic lows across every major survey. The fertility rate is declining. Homelessness reached a record 771,000 in 2024. Drug overdose deaths, despite recent declines, remain elevated. Emigration of skilled professionals is increasing. Life expectancy in the United States is lower than in comparable developed nations and has declined in recent years, a phenomenon not seen in any other wealthy country. And the country is currently fighting a war in the Middle East that has closed a critical shipping lane, triggered an energy crisis the IEA called the greatest in history, pushed inflation to its worst monthly spike in 4 years, and drained the strategic petroleum reserve to its lowest level since the 1980s. Every single one of these indicators was present in previous empires during their stage 7, not some of them, all of them: debt, currency, debasement, military overextension, infrastructure decay, social fragmentation, institutional distrust, declining demographics, hollowed-out productive capacity, rising inequality, political dysfunction, external military commitments that consume resources needed domestically, and a population that is too divided to agree on the diagnosis, let alone the cure. Gallup's annual Confidence in Institutions survey tells the story in a single data set. In 1975, 42% of Americans had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in Congress. By 2024, that number was 8%. 8%. 92% of Americans do not have confidence in the institution that is supposed to represent them. Confidence in the presidency has fallen from 52% to below 30%. Confidence in the Supreme Court has fallen from 49% to 25%. Confidence in television news has fallen from 46% to 11%. Confidence in newspapers has fallen from 51% to 18%. Confidence in big business has fallen from 34% to 14%. Confidence in the medical system has fallen from 80% in 1975 to approximately 34%. Confidence in the public school system has fallen from 62% to 26%. Every single major American institution has lost the majority of public confidence over the past 50 years. Every one. And the erosion is not partisan. It crosses party lines, income levels, age groups, and geographic regions. Americans do not disagree about whether institutions are failing. They agree on that, they disagree about why, and about who is to blame, and about what should replace them. That disagreement, the universal acknowledgement of failure combined with the inability to agree on a solution, is Glubb's age of decadence, transitioning into stage 7. The empire knows something is wrong. It cannot agree on what. And while it argues, the structural decay continues, day by day, dollar by dollar, institution by institution, until the arguments themselves become irrelevant because the system they are arguing about has already been replaced by something else. Something less democratic. Something less stable. Something that emerges not from deliberate reform, but from the vacuum left by the institutions that lost the public's trust and never earned it back. And here is the part of this video that I need you to hear clearly, because it is the most important part. Knowing this pattern does not mean America is guaranteed to collapse. Glubb himself was careful to note that his theory was not deterministic. It was diagnostic. It identifies the symptoms. It does not prescribe the outcome. The 250-year cycle is a pattern, not a prophecy. But it is a pattern that has held with remarkable consistency across every empire in recorded history. And the United States is now exhibiting every symptom on the diagnostic checklist at the exact point in the cycle when those symptoms are expected to appear. The question is not whether America matches the pattern. It does. The question is whether America will be the first empire in 3,000 years to break the pattern. And the only way to break a pattern is to first acknowledge that it exists, which requires looking at the evidence with open eyes rather than through the lens of exceptionalism that tells you this time is different because it is us. Every empire believed it was the exception. The Romans believed Rome was eternal. The British believed the sun would never set on their empire. The Spanish believed God had chosen them, and every one of them entered stage 7 believing they were immune to the cycle that had consumed every empire before them. They were not. And the evidence, the debt, the downgrades, the declining dollar, the crumbling infrastructure, the overextended military, the record distrust, the historic pessimism, the hollowed-out middle class, the energy crisis, the fertility decline, the social fragmentation, says that America is not the exception either. It is the latest example, and the 250th anniversary is arriving, and the clock does not stop because you stop looking at it. The only question is what ordinary Americans do with this information, not the politicians, not the generals, not the Wall Street billionaires. You. Because every empire in history was full of ordinary people who went about their daily lives while the pattern played out around them, and most of them did not realize what was happening until the currency they held could no longer buy what it bought last year, until the institutions they trusted could no longer deliver what they promised, until the military that was supposed to protect them was too far from home to protect anything. Those ordinary people are not a footnote in the history of fallen empires. They are the story. And right now, in June of 2026, you are one of them. Share this video with every American you know, because the information in this video is the difference between understanding the pattern and being consumed by it. And the 250-year clock does not have a snooze button. And one last thing. Glubb observed something that most people who cite his work miss entirely. He noted that the decline of every empire contained within it the seeds of the next civilization. The fall of Rome produced medieval Christendom, which produced the Renaissance, which produced the modern world. The fall of the British Empire produced the American century. The fall of one order always contains the birth of another. The question for Americans is not whether the 250-year cycle applies. The evidence says it does. The question is what comes next. And the answer to that question depends entirely on what ordinary Americans do in the next decade. Not the politicians, not the billionaires, not the institutions. You. Because Glubb also observed that in every empire, during stage 7, a small minority of citizens recognized the pattern, understood the trajectory, and began building the local, community-level, family-level resilience that survived the transition and became the foundation of whatever came next. Benedict of Nursia founded his monasteries while Rome was collapsing around him. Those monasteries preserved literacy, agriculture, and civil order through centuries of chaos. They did not save the empire. They saved what mattered. And in America, in 2026, the people who are paying down debt, who are building local community networks, who are learning practical skills, who are strengthening their families, who are reducing their dependence on systems they can see are failing, are the modern equivalents of Benedict's monasteries. They are not saving the empire, they are building the structures that will survive the transition. And the people who are watching this video right now are already ahead, because awareness is the first act of preparation, and preparation, not denial, not panic, not political tribalism, is the only rational response to a 250-year pattern that has never been broken. And if you are still watching, let me tell you what Glubb said happens to ordinary people during stage 7 that nobody ever quotes because it is too uncomfortable to repeat. He said that during the final stage, ordinary citizens of the empire develop what he called a spirit of pessimism that becomes self-reinforcing. They stop planning for the future because they no longer believe the future will be better than the present. They stop investing in their communities because they no longer believe the community will endure. They stop having children because they no longer believe the world their children would inherit is worth inheriting. The U.S. fertility rate has fallen to 1.62 births per woman, the lowest in the history of the Republic. Bloomberg reported that the United States may see its first population decline in 2026. 7 in 10 Americans told pollsters that raising a child is unaffordable. Those are not economic statistics. Those are the vital signs of a civilization that has lost confidence in its own continuation. And Glubb warned that the spirit of pessimism, once it takes hold, creates a feedback loop that accelerates the decline. Because when people stop building, stop investing, stop having families, and stop believing, the productive energy that sustained the empire in its earlier stages evaporates. And the empire that was built by optimistic, sacrificing, forward-looking pioneers is consumed by pessimistic, self-protective, backward-looking inheritors who cannot imagine creating what their ancestors created because they have never been required to create anything. They have only been required to consume, and consumption without creation is the definition of decline. That is where we are. That is stage 7, and the 250-year clock is not ticking down to midnight. It has already struck midnight. The question is whether you heard it, and what you do now that you have. Share this video with every American you know. Not for the views, not for the algorithm, because 3,000 years of history say the pattern is real, because 250 years of American history say the timing is exact, because Glubb, Dalio, and Turchin all reached the same conclusion using different methods across different decades, and because the most dangerous thing an empire can do in stage 7 is pretend that stage 7 does not exist.